thank you so much, Doug, for being here. It's such an honor to have you here because obviously your background is really something we pride and talk about a lot in How to Be Books about the Authors Guild and the amazing work that they always do. So, first of all, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Amazing. So, Doug Preston is the author of 39 books, if you can believe it, of both nonfiction and fiction, of which 32 have been New York Times bestsellers. He is the co author with Lincoln Child of the Pendergast series of thrillers, and he worked as an editor at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and also taught nonfiction writing at Princeton University. And I also pointed at the fact that, he's got the amazing Nanotyrannosaurus Rex skull behind him as well. He is the co-editor of this amazing new book called 14 Days, alongside co-editor Margaret Atwood, and is the current president of the Authors Guild, which is America's largest and oldest association of authors and journalists. So this is such an amazing collection, and I just have to ask, which is, how did you come up with this idea to create a collective novel? And given it's so complicated, how did you decide this format?
Well, that's a good question. It was a very long journey. Um, at the Authors Guild, we wanted at some point to do an anthology, but
Mm,
because we represent all kinds of authors, poets, nonfiction, journalists, literary, romance writers, we obviously an anthology isn't going to work, right?
mm,
So when the pandemic hit, we suddenly came up with this idea of a group of New Yorkers living in a shabby tenement building on the Lower East Side who are the left behinds. They're trapped in New
mm,
York during the pandemic. All the wealthy people have left, and they start going up to the rooftop to cheer on the uh, first responders.
mm,
But like typical New Yorkers, they ignore each other. They want nothing to do with each other. But after a while, they start talking to each other, and then they start telling each other stories.
mm,
Pretty soon, they're forming a little community on the rooftop, a pandemic community during lockdown, during the early days of the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic hit New York City
yeah.
extremely hard. I mean, the city was shut down. It was really brutal.
Mm,
Uh, well, probably in the United States, one of the most affected areas.
yeah.
So, uh, this group forms a little community, and they tell stories about their lives. They tell ghost stories. They confess crimes. They talk about loves. They talk about the horrors of war.
Mm,
All kinds of things. Very few stories are actually about the pandemic. Most of them are about their lives, their loves, their but just crazy stories they've heard, and so forth. And then at the end, there's a very big surprise.
definitely.
Everything about it, because I don't want to give it away.
No, no, definitely not. We're definitely going to stay clear of the spoiler for sure. And obviously, as you mentioned, it's got so many diverse voices, and like what 36 authors came together to write this, which is absolutely mammoth. And so, how did you get them all together? Did they come to you? Did you go to them? And like, also, what I found really interesting was that it's anonymous the whole way through until right at the end where you can read who wrote what. So, how do you think that also impacted the reader's experience of that?
Well, Margaret Atwood was the general editor, and she was the one who went out and helped recruit all these wonderful authors. And we have 36
Wow.
authors in all genres. I mean, we have nonfiction writers, we have journalists, we have romance writers, we have literary authors of also incredible backgrounds and diversity. And we can thank Margaret for that. Her name, her encouragement was absolutely crucial, and she herself wrote a story
Mm,
for the rooftop as well, which is a most curious and interesting story. One of the most curious of the whole collection. So the second part of your so we got all these stories,
mm,
and then we had to write a frame narrative, and that was my
mm,
job, was to
right.
write the frame narrative. Now, this is like the Decameron or Thousand and One Nights. These are stories within stories. So the frame narrative is the superintendent of the building, who's a young woman named Yessie,
Mm.
who secretly is recording all these stories that people are telling. She's doing it secretly because they would not be happy if they
No.
knew. And then late at night, she's back in her apartment transcribing all these stories and adding all her sarcastic and dry and acerbic commentary. And so the stories are embedded within her story.
Mm.
Now, the question is about the bylines. These 36 authors, you don't know when you're reading this book who wrote which story. And there's a purpose to that. Well, first of all, it would have seemed strange to have fictional characters telling stories, and then you suddenly interrupt and say, oh, this story was written by John
Mm.
Grisham, or
True.
this story was written by Margaret Atwood or Diana Gabaldon. No, that wouldn't work. So, but at the same time, there's a deeper reason for that. And that is that we wanted to get away from the celebrity author, the best
Mm.
selling author, the big name author. We wanted to level the playing field and make it anonymous and equal. So
Mm.
the only way you know who wrote which story is to go to the back of the book, and it's very inconveniently arranged, so you really have to look around and hunt to find out who wrote which story.
Yeah, I promise I did not look at the back. I read the whole thing and then looked at the end, and I was very surprised actually to see who wrote what. And actually, were the authors themselves aware of what was being written, like the other person was writing, and how their story kind of went into the overall story?
Yes, the way the actual process was that we got the stories first, and then I with an editor, where we worked together to order them in a certain order, and then I wrote the frame narrative.
Hmm.
And the first iteration of that didn't work. It was a failure.
Oh.
Uh, I mean, it was, you know, I'm an author and I don't like failing, but, I have a bunch of manuscripts half completed in drawers that might as well be thrown out. That's
Oh.
part of being an author. So then we did it all over again. We rearranged the stories. We created new characters telling them. We got rid of
Mm.
some other characters. I wrote the frame narrative again, and this time it worked.
Mm.
So that's sort of, and then of course we showed the frame narratives around each author's story so that they could approve it or disapprove it. And of course, we had some authors say, "Well, I don't like this character saying that about my story," or, but most of them actually did. Um, it was actually, most of them liked the whole fictional construction, the whole conceit of the book, very much. And so I thought we'd have a lot more protesting or rewriting or interfering or whatever, and that didn't happen.
Yeah, it's so unique. I was just like, wow, I've never seen a collective novel like that where it's just like, oh, wow, you don't even know that there's a gap between the voices. It's just sort of like really flows from one into the other. And that reminds me of course, you wrote so like two stories yourself in the book. And, I can say at least one of them is probably one of the most pivotal and poignant tales. And how did you feel about writing that final final story?
Well, that's interesting because I realized when we had the ending that we have, which we can't talk about,
No.
I realized, okay, there has to be a certain fictional closure to this.
Mm,
And what has happened during the book is that the characters on the rooftop have become a story in themselves
mm,
and their lives, and the reader has started to care a lot about them and their lives. These are the persons telling the stories. So you needed closure.
yeah.
And so I wrote that closure. Now, the stories that I wrote, I know this is strange to say, but they're all autobiographical
Mm,
with some tweaks. That's what fictional authors do.
Yeah.
So it's not 100% true, but it's 90% true. And even that story at the end involving the pet starling that flies away, that comes out of my life. That actually
Oh,
happened.
oh
So,
gosh. So how did you feel like writing that then? Did it sort of strike something in you? And, obviously this was also written during such a tough time for so many people as well, the backdrop of COVID-19. So, so why do you feel this was also the best setting for the novel as well?
well, the COVID pandemic, I think in general, um, caused a lot of us, maybe everybody, to stand back and reevaluate and look at their lives. I mean, anytime something terrible like this happens, it stops you, it
Hmm.
wakes you up, it makes you ask yourself questions that you wouldn't have asked if nothing had happened.
Hmm.
Tragedy and uh, like this really is affecting the way we look at ourselves. And so that's what's happened to these characters on the rooftop. But it also happened to me personally.
Hmm.
Looking back on my life, I'm 67 years old. I'm at that age where you start looking back and thinking about things that have happened to me and trying to make sense of them and then writing about them. And
Hmm.
that's really, you know, I mean, in a general sense, storytelling, we human beings tell stories to transmit values, to explain the world
Hmm.
that is essentially unexplainable, tragic, and in many ways incomprehensible.
Yeah.
But we tell each other stories to make sense of this, to try to find our place in this world. And that's what's happening on the rooftop. These people who've been so uh, trapped by the pandemic, so affected, are telling stories to make sense of this thing that's happening to them. And
Yeah.
it goes back to I think storytelling is written into our genes. If you look at every
Hmm.
culture on earth, storytelling is at the center of their culture. It doesn't matter where or what group you're talking about, but storytelling is always central. It's something built into our genes. Obviously, we humans cope with the world by telling each other stories.
Yeah, I completely agree. All those prehistoric, cave paintings are basically forms of stories that were told, and I do you feel then storytelling is sort of there is more need for storytelling, especially during times of crisis.
Yes, exactly true. We don't tell each other stories when everything's just fine and dandy.
Mm,
We're just ticking along with our lives and everyone's happy and satisfied and comfortable.
mm.
And stories about that aren't very interesting. I mean, nobody reads Dante's Paradiso, right?
Yeah,
Because it's all about heaven. It's
true.
boring. Who wants to read about heaven? But everybody reads the Inferno
Oh yeah,
because that's so grim and dark and
yeah.
horrifying. I mean, we are attracted to stories about humans in difficulty, in tragedy, in war, in death, uh, and love and birth and everything else. But
Mm,
good stories, all the great stories involve darkness, and it's really a way for us human beings to cope with things like the pandemic.
mm. Definitely, and it seemed like that in the story as well. They were just finding a way with each other to find a space for each other, and we can say like so much is happening at the moment, even in terms of literature in the US, and obviously the Authors Guild has been great. Being at the forefront of it. And so, how do you think maybe the novel also represents the values of the Authors Guild?
Well, in a very basic sense, all the proceeds from this novel are supporting the Authors Guild in fighting book banning, in fighting the big uh, artificial intelligence companies
Yeah.
that have stolen hundreds of thousands of our books for ingestion to build these these AI models without compensation and without permission, to push back against piracy websites,
Hmm.
push back against big tech's attack on copyright.
Mm.
And this whole information wants to be free movement, which is basically big tech taking our creative work and for themselves without compensation,
Yeah.
wrapping it in advertising so that they're monetizing our creative work, and then coming back and telling us, oh, you're selfish to want to get paid for your work. It's so the Authors Guild is really at the forefront in nurturing freedom of expression, pushing back against book banning, and supporting authors' rights and supporting literary culture. And so all the proceeds from this book are going 100% to finance those efforts.
Wow. That's huge. That is absolutely massive, and bravo, because obviously this is massive things happening at the moment with literature and book banning, especially in the US. It's particularly bad, and most of them are just anthologies. But I've never seen a novel, a full novel created by so many people that you can't even tell where the beginning of each story is and where the end of each story is. I thought that was really remarkable. I was just like, oh, I didn't even notice there was like a gap between the two. So I was like, wow, absolutely seamless. So well done, Doug. That was fantastic. Good editing.
Well, thank you. You know, it's interesting because earlier iterations had the stories set out, they had titles to the stories. And at a certain point, we said, you know, that's not really the best way to do this. These are people on a rooftop telling stories, and it's
Mm.
going to be a seamless, it's really going to be a novel. You know, anthologies are kind of boring, right? You know, I mean, I don't often read anthologies. I like short stories,
Mm.
and but you know, anthologies. This is not anything like that, and we wanted to really differentiate this novel from the anthology genre because it's not. It's not at
No.
all. It's meant to be start at the beginning and read through to the end.
Well, I think you've created a new format. So, absolutely. I thought this was really perfect way for the Authors Guild to really cement themselves as a completely create a whole new genre of writing and just be like, okay, this is what we do. I thought it was brilliant. And obviously, the book isn't out yet, is it? So, when is the book actually out?
Well, it's published on February 6th, and by HarperCollins,
Mm,
and it's getting very good advanced reviews, really good. I'm very happy with those reviews, and I hope that it sells well because, as I said, every penny is
yeah.
going to support our fight. And I just want to say something about the Authors Guild. You know, we have 6 attorneys on staff.
Oh, wow.
We're suing the book banners. We're not just talking about it. We are actually taking action. We have won every single lawsuit that we've participated in, and we have also um, written amicus briefs, and all of those
Wow.
have won. I mean, this book banning is unconstitutional, and we're you know fighting that not just with talk,
Mm,
because you know we live in a world that's full of talk, right?
yeah.
We are suing people. For example, we're suing Microsoft and we're
Bravo.
suing OpenAI for ingesting hundreds of thousands of books, copyrighted books by our members, without permission and without compensation to build ChatGPT, which is a very valuable commercial product. We're not telling them to stop AI. We're not trying to stop AI. We're just going and saying, look, you know, this is a valuable commercial product. If you're going to use our copyrighted material to build this product, you have to compensate us because let's face it, books in building AI systems, books are the highest quality
Yeah,
input. I mean, if they
absolutely.
just scraped all the stuff off the web, you know, blogs and pornography, whatever they've got, it'd be awful, right?
Yeah.
Books
Mm,
are what give ChatGPT and other large language model AI systems their quality.
yeah.
So we're saying you've got to compensate authors and creators, not just authors, but photographers,
Yeah.
artists, musicians. All this stuff is being stolen wholesale. Well, we're fighting back legally. um, and uh, and I feel pretty sure we're going to win on
Good.
behalf of the authors of America.
I'm glad to hear that because exactly as you say, they've got a valuable product only because the valuable products that you've already created yourself. This is the thing. ChatGPT is only as good as the things that it's being fed with. So, that's why, the thing is that they've just given absolutely no regard to creatives in this industry at all. I've read even the Meta's statement. Meta's chief AI scientist said, yes, books should be given for free. And whilst selling his own book for $20 on Amazon, I was like, wow, the hypocrisy of this is unbelievable. So, it just goes to show. I think there's a lot of talk around AI, but not actual no actual actions regarding it. So, yes, well done for the Authors Guild for doing this great just service for all authors out there and journalists. And we'll make sure we get the links in as well for the book and also to the Authors Guild itself, so everyone can go and buy the book and support the cause. So, yeah, again, Doug, thank you so much for being with us this today to talk about this incredible project, and we're looking forward to hearing all about how it goes. Really,
Well, thank you so much. You certainly asked some good questions.